Negotiations to hammer out a deal to reshape NAFTA, the three-nation trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, will continue this week after talks between the White House and Canada stalled amid some bitterness. Joining us now to discuss the potential fallout for American workers is the president of the AFL-CIO, Richard Trumka. Mr. Trumka, President Trump has negotiated a new NAFTA deal with Mexico, but talks with Canada stalled after some off-the-record comments that he made were published, that he acknowledged that he won't make any concessions to Canada. And here's what he said about that afterwards.
Here's the good news. At least Canada knows where I stand, because we can't have these countries taking advantage of the United States anymore. It's very simple.
Question, can you support a deal that leaves Canada out of a new NAFTA, and will Congress pass it?
Well, Chris, before I get to that, just let me say, on behalf of the hardworking men and women of this country who wake our country up every day, make her run all day, and put her to bed at night, let me wish you a happy Labor's Day, and all your listeners a happy Labor Day. Look, our economies are integrated. The three countries in North America, the economy is pretty integrated. And it's pretty hard to see how that would work without having Canada in the deal. You said that the Mexican deal is closed. There's still a lot of work to be left to be done, even on the Mexican deal, Chris, because the language isn't drafted. We haven't seen whole chapters of the thing. We're anxious to move forward with it and anxious to have all three countries involved, because NAFTA has had a devastating effect on the working people of this country for the last 25 years. So we've been aggressively pursuing an agreement that works for the workers in all three countries, and I can say we're not done yet.
Okay, but let's talk about the parts of the deal we do know about that the Trump administration has negotiated with Mexico that it seems to me would be pretty good for workers. Let's put them up on the screen. 75% of a car's value would have to be manufactured in North America. That's up from 62.5%. 40 to 45% of the car must be made by workers in whatever country earning at least $16 an hour. Do you support both of those provisions? And frankly, do you think that Mexico would live up to them? For instance, the salary for car workers, because in Mexico right now, the salary for a car worker on average is $3 an hour. Do you think they actually are going to boost that to $16 an hour?
Well, first of all, those provisions can be very, very good. And you said that the current provision is really 62.5. In actuality, Chris, it's only in the 40s because they do a little cheating, saying if you put in 62% and China puts in 38%, it counts as 100%. So it's really lower, and the change is really more effective. We haven't seen the details of it yet, but you hit the nail right on the head. It doesn't matter what's in that agreement. If we can't monitor it and affect it and enforce it effectively, then the agreement will fail for workers and it will fail for the country. So what we're pushing right now, and we're working with Ambassador Lighthizer, is a way to let us effectively monitor what's going on the ground and then enforce the agreement regardless of who's in the White House. Because we've been told for over 25 years, trust us, this agreement will be good for workers. What we need is an agreement that we can enforce no matter who's in the White House. That's what we're looking for.
Let me step back for a minute and go broader view. How does big labor feel about President Trump at this point? I mean, the fact is growth is up, unemployment is down. He's using tariffs to try to break down trade barriers that I know that you hate. So, I mean, what mark do you give Donald Trump on this Labor Day weekend?
You know, when he was elected, I said I would call balls and strikes. When he did something that was good for workers, we'd support him. When he did something that was bad for workers, we would oppose him. Unfortunately, to date, the things that he's done to hurt workers outpace what he's done to help workers. He hasn't come up with an infrastructure program that could put a lot of us back to work. He overturned a regulation that would actually denied over 5 million people overtime that they would have had. He overturned some health and safety regulations that will hurt us on the job. Enforcement of OSHA and MSHA isn't what it should be. So we keep trying
Yeah.
to find areas where we can work with them
Well, but
and where
let me,
we can.
Mr. Trumka, let me ask you. I mean, 3.9% unemployment, 3.5 million jobs created, 4%, 4.2% GDP in the last quarter. I mean, don't you give them something for that?
No, those are good. But wages have been down since the first of the year. Gas prices have been up since the first of the year. So overall, workers aren't doing as well. He passed a tax bill that encourages companies to outsource. We can't agree to support something like that. He's every place we can, Chris, we do. But unfortunately, right now, the scale is weighted against him because he's done more to hurt workers than to help workers.
So you have launched a new big political campaign for the midterms. You have an ad out on the web right now. Is it your hope that Democrats would take back control of the House and Senate and block the Trump agenda, even those parts that have been good for workers, like creating 3.5 million new jobs?
It's not about Democrats or Republicans. It's about electing people that will support working people in this country. That's what we're looking to do. We started a couple of months ago going door to door, member to member with our members, saying what issues are important to you. We put those together. We're going to put them in front of candidates. Those candidates that support the issues that our members say they want, need, and should have are the candidates that we'll support. It probably will be Democrats because unfortunately, Democrats support working people more than Republicans have. We'd like to change that, but the reality is Democrats support working people more than Republicans, although we go candidate by candidate, and we support those Republicans that support working people.
Finally, this week, I looked at the presidential exit polls from 2016. Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump in union households by just 9 points, 51% to 42, which, interestingly enough, is the smallest Democratic advantage since Reagan ran against Mondale in 1984. Question, don't a lot of your members, union members, don't they support Donald Trump? Well,
actually, 3 percentage points more of our members voted for Donald Trump than they did for Mitt Romney. Unfortunately, 10% of our members, 10% fewer of our members voted for Hillary Clinton. They didn't believe her on trade. They didn't believe her on a couple of other issues. But you talked about households. Union members themselves are a much higher percentage in there. Again, we give them all the facts. And I believe in my membership, the rank and file, that when they get the facts, they make the right decision every time. We're giving them the facts on this president and anybody who's running against him, and they'll ultimately decide which one of those candidates that they want to support.
Mr. Trumka, thank you. Thanks for sharing part of this Labor Day holiday weekend with us. We'll stay on top of all this, sir.
Chris, thanks for having me on. And again, happy Labor Day.
When we come back, the Trump administration opens the door to regulating Google. Our Sunday panel returns to discuss the battle with big tech. That's next.
I think Canada very much wants to make the deal, and I think it's going to be obviously very good for Canada if they do, and I think it's probably not going to be good at all if they don't.
President Trump playing hardball with Canada as he tries to rewrite the quarter-century-old North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. And we're back now with the panel. Well, Congresswoman Edwards, there was a lot of howling, I think it's fair to say, from Democrats when President Trump said that he was going to revamp NAFTA. But aren't there, and I talked about it with Mr. Trumka, aren't there a number of provisions in this agreement with Mexico, at least, that are good for American workers?
Well, I think there are also a lot of Democrats who very much want to see a North American Free Trade Agreement that really invests in workers, that makes sure that we have protections across both borders. And I think you heard that from what Mr. Trumka was saying. And I think
but raising the wage to $16 an hour, raising the amount that has to be content from North America.
Right, and all those are actually things that many of us as Democrats have been calling for a long time, because we can have free trade, but if it's not fair on both sides of the border, it really doesn't work. It doesn't keep workers here working, and it doesn't make sure that workers in Mexico are being paid what they need. And I don't think you can have a North American free trade agreement without having the other part of North America, which is Canada, in the deal too.
Let me pick up on that with you, Mark Lotter, because talks with Canada stalled on Friday over, it seems, two issues. One is continued dairy protections inside Canada, and secondly, the publishing of off-the-record comments by President Trump, where he basically said, I'm not going to offer any concessions at all to Canada. Does this deal go through? And I'm primarily, I guess, talking about Congress. Does this deal go through without Canada on board?
I think it makes it much easier if Canada's on board to get it through Congress. But this is very tough negotiating with the president and the prime minister and the Canadian officials. The president is very clear he wants to get this done. He wants Canada to be involved. And it's just going to be a question now of, can they make enough concessions to make it fair on both sides? I think they will.
Let's turn to another big story this week, and that is President Trump complaining that Google's search engine, when you put in President Trump News, has been calibrated to drown out conservative voices. The president and his team this week complained about that and even talked about regulating Google. Here's the president.
I've made it clear that we as a country cannot tolerate political censorship, blacklisting, and rigged search results. We're not going to let them control what we can and cannot see, read, and learn from. We can't do that.
Chuck, first of all, from the best of your knowledge, is there political bias in the Google search? I mean, is it calibrated to drown out conservative voices and to push liberal points of view? And secondly, what do you make of the threat by the president that the government might get involved in regulating Google?
Well, the best of my knowledge about Google's algorithms is not very good.
Well, that's why I asked you, because I don't know.
But I would be very surprised if somebody at Google said, let's set up the algorithm to drown out Donald Trump in any specific sense like that. I think these searches work in incredibly complex ways that, for some unconscious or otherwise neutral reason, may be turning up what President Trump claims they're turning up. But of course, it's just his claim. But there's a bigger context for this, which is a lot of stuff going on at Google, like a few months back, an employee circulating a memo internally claiming that the company isolates conservatives internally. Then he winds up on the outs. There's a movement within Google to decouple Google, so to speak, from defense contracting and so forth. And I think the president's pushing back against those things, and he's more generally trying to turn Google into just another part of this big fake news media that has been his big foil all through his political career. You know, there's a lot of suspicion, both on the left and the right, in sort of populist America about these giant technology companies. And I think in that sense, he's just trying to turn them into another one of his scapegoats to show like everything is stacked against us, even the search engines.
Mark, your thoughts about whether the government should be regulating a company like Google? Are there First Amendment issues there? And if they weren't going to regulate Google in terms of its search engine, they can do a number of things just to make life difficult for Google.
No doubt. And look, I think the fact that there is conservative bias in social media, it's not just Google, it's Facebook, it's Twitter. There's been a lot of accusations that probably the only place where there's more anti-conservative bias than the legacy media is Silicon Valley. So, you know, and the fact is a lot of people are getting their news from Silicon Valley in a way that they weren't a few years ago. And so Trump is raising a valid point. Where he loses me is when he says that he wants the government to start regulating it, because the only institution I trust less than Google to regulate my search is the federal government. So I think what we need is for people to be more proactive in terms of where they get their news and how they consume their news. One of the advent of social media has given conservatives an incredible voice that they didn't have before, because they didn't have to go through the Washington Post and the New York Times. So they have a voice that they never had before. But we're also in these ideological silos where conservatives only read conservative news sources, liberals only watch and read liberal news sources. And I think we all need to do a better job of policing ourselves and getting out of our silos silos and listening to the other side, because that's how we get over the division in the country.
Congressman Edwards, I want to pick up on the last point that Chuck made, and that is, isn't there a legitimate concern, and on this populist issue, about companies, whether it's Google or Facebook or Twitter or Amazon, these huge companies that have so much power and so much money and so much influence?
Well, I mean, but the concern, I think, is really misplaced, because if you look at these entities, every time there, is this sort of massive growth in this industry, something else starts up that becomes the next new thing. I mean, remember when Twitter was the next new thing and Instagram the next new thing. And so I think that the dynamism that's in the industry allows that to, to create an environment where you can have a lot of different kinds of voices in there. And I think if anything is getting in the way of it in terms of the government, I think it's saying, these decisions around net neutrality, because then that makes it even more difficult for conservative or even, far left views to get into the mainstream if you're put on this secondary highway. So, but the idea that the government should have the ability to figure out what the search engine is, I don't think so. I mean, most of the people I know in Congress can't even operate their Twitter handles.
I am remaining silent in this conversation. I'm a Luddite, which go to Google and look up what it means. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday. Up next, our Power Player of the Week, Dolly Parton, and why kids around the world call her the Book Lady. Across the country and overseas. A book every month to kids who sign up from birth till they turn 5 and go to kindergarten. What does it mean to a child to get their own book mailed to them in their own name?
It makes them feel important, makes them feel special. So of course it makes them want to do what the book is all about, learn to read it.
Local communities pay for the books, but Dolly's group pays for sending out more than $1 million a month, which she helps cover through her companies and concerts and even a children's album.
Oh, millions of dollars, I'm sure.
And it's that important to you?
Oh, it's very important because it's my charity. Although there are many things that I do, this is the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart.
Dolly has been performing for more than 60 years. She's won 8 Grammys and is in the Country Music Hall of Fame. But she shows no sign at all of slowing down.
My music is everything to me. It's my gift, it's my joy, it's my job, and it's just something that I love to do, and I never think about that I should quit it.
Which brings us back to the Imagination Library. Now, I understand that you have gotten a nickname from this program.
I'm the Book Lady. Who knew?
We are so honored that the 100th millionth book.
So there was Dolly with the Librarian of Congress donating the 100 millionth book, unveiling a copy of her own coat of many colors, based on the coat her mother made for her out of scraps of cloth.
Maybe we'll be back for our 1,000th book.
All right.
Wouldn't that be nice?
What does it mean to you, Library of Congress?
I know, and here I am, little old country girl from the Smoky Mountains of East Tennessee. Now one of my little books about my mom and a story about my dad is going to be here forever in the Library of Congress.
Dolly even gave us a little concert about the coat and her family and what led her to share her dream with so many children.
In my coat of many colors that my mama made for me, made only from rags, but I wore it so proudly. And although we had no money, I was rich as I could be. In my coat of many colors, mama made for me, 'cause she made it just for me. Dolly's Imagination Library now teams up with the Library of Congress for a special story time for kids the last Friday of each month, streaming online. And speaking of kids, I want to introduce you to a special one, Jack Henry Wallace, who was born on Friday, 8 pounds, 6 ounces. Jack will make his television debut in December as part of our annual Christmas greeting from now, the 6 Wallace grandkids. Jack, his mom and dad, and yes, his proud grandpa are all doing well. And that's it for today. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Fox News Sunday.
this election, you aren't just voting for a candidate, you're voting for which party controls Congress. Very, very big vote. It's very close. People say we have the majority. By how much? Like, by almost nothing. Somebody has a cold, we no longer have the majority. We need Republicans in Congress.
Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. That was President Trump Thursday night at a rally in Evansville, Indiana, urging Republicans to get out and vote in November. Labor Day weekend, of course, the traditional start to the fall campaign season, following the last major primaries Tuesday in Florida and Arizona. We begin in Florida, where a high-stakes governor's race is taking shape, pitting the Bernie Sanders-backed mayor of Tallahassee, Democrat Andrew Gillum, against Ron DeSantis, a Republican congressman with close ties to President Trump. Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn and editorial page writer Kate Batchelder Odell. So, Kim, what's your main takeaway from the Florida and Arizona contests?
Well, the Florida race, we're about to see a battle of the opposing sides of the Republican and Democratic parties. This is going to be a huge matchup between a sort of Trump Republican, as it were, but a full-out Bernie Sanders progressive. And we'll get a sense in that important state about where the country is viewing some of these Bernie Sanders progressive policies. Out in Arizona, I think this is going to be a kind of bellwether, again, for some of the policies that President Trump was talking about. This is going to be a hard-fought battle in the Senate race in particular there between Martha McSally and Kyrsten Sinema. And this is going to be a question about whether or not the Arizonans, again, bellwether state, whether or not Trump policies are enough to help Republicans keep these houses.
Yeah, Kate, it looks like to me that in Arizona, at least, the Republicans really dodged what would have been a very difficult candidate if the other two had won, Joe Arpaio or Kelly Ward. So in McSally, they have the best candidate they can bring to that race, but that's still going to be a very close contest in Arizona, and Republicans could easily lose that seat.
Absolutely. I mean, Democrats have to defend 26 seats, and they know that they've got to pick up Arizona if they want to take the Senate back. Now, you note that McSally did win, but she was running against two completely unpalatable candidates who split up the opposing vote, so that certainly helped her. So she definitely has a tough race going into it, but she also has some personal story, like being one of the first female Air Force fighter pilots, that I think will diffuse some of the issues that the left tries to throw at Republicans.
All right, Bill, the lesson looks to me from Arizona and Florida in particular, but if you look at Florida, the governor's race in Georgia, some of the other contests, this election is not going to be a kind of a classic rush to the middle and try to occupy the middle. It's going to be a mobilization of the bases election in some of these states.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Florida is the closest to that Trump-Bernie kind of matchup that we want. I think the Democrats
dream matchup.
Right. I think the Democrats made a mistake in that case because I'm not sure I think there is enthusiasm for the Bernie candidates in the Democratic Party, but I think they're more likely to win in a congressional district than statewide. I think it's very hard to take that message statewide.
Why is that? I mean,
well, just because I think it's a far more left-wing message. You abolish ICE, it just lends you to there's not the liberal majorities in the states that there may be in congressional districts like in the north and so forth. In Arizona, I think what's interesting, two things are interesting. One is I think McSally is a very strong candidate. She didn't just limp into this victor's circle. She defeated both her opponents. Her total was more than their combined vote. So she's a very strong candidate. The interesting thing there is both McSally and her Democratic opponent have vacated House seats that will themselves become contested, for the majority, and could go either way.
Kim, it would be a real earthquake in American politics if a state like Florida, which is seen generally as a centrist, center-right state, would elect a governor who is for single-payer health care. I mean, that would be really something.
Yeah, and look, I agree with Bill. I think it seems unlikely, and that the Democrats have chosen a difficult candidate to elect here. If you look and you drill down into the Florida numbers, the Republican nominee in the end, Rick DeSantis, got significantly more votes than the Democratic candidate, Mr. Gillum, got. Republican turnout was higher. overall, both in Florida and Arizona, which, by the way, is something that was giving some, it was good news for some Republicans who are hoping that their base and their voters are beginning to pay attention to the economy and wake up. But the fundamentals there are definitely not necessarily with a progressive candidate to win a statewide election.
Kate, let's look at broaden this out to look at the Senate contest more generally here for the overall control of the Senate. And for, Rick Scott, for example, the governor of Florida, two-term governor, running against Bill Nelson. He's slightly ahead in the polls, which is interesting because it suggests that, to me, if he's able to defeat Nelson, the incumbent, that means that it would be very hard for Democrats to take control. Why is Scott doing so well?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, he has a good record as governor, that he's basically gone around the state every week as governor to meet people and hear what their issues are. And so I think he's got a strong record and a name ID that people like him in Florida. But it's a good question whether the DeSantis issue will complicate that for him, and I think it potentially could, given that he's been somewhat of a controversial character.
DeSantis he's prone sometimes to statements. He said, he used the phrase monkey up this week, and of course Democrats immediately jumped on that as it having a racist component to it, but although that seemed unlikely to me. But those kinds of mistakes are things that can get your opponent elected.
Absolutely, Paul. And think about it. We're looking at what should be a very hard map for Democrats in the Senate, but none of them are obvious to lose. I mean, we're still seeing tough contests in North Dakota and Missouri, for instance, where Heidi Heitkamp and Claire McCaskill really should be more vulnerable than they are.
Bill, quickly, any races you'd like us to watch?
Well, as a citizen of the People's Republic of New Jersey, Stan, it's interesting that Bob Menendez is in a little trouble, that the DNC is having to spend money to defend his seat. His Republican opponent, Bob Eugen, is campaigning on being an honest Marine, and he seems to just be hammering on the ethics issue. In the end, I sort of think Menendez will pull it out because I don't have confidence.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. The big story this week is confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump's Supreme Court nominee who could shift the balance of power on the court for a generation. Kavanaugh faces days of tough questioning from the Senate Judiciary Committee. In a moment, we'll speak with two leading members of that panel. But first, the nation's long goodbye to Senator John McCain. McCain will be laid to rest today in a private ceremony at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, which meant so much to him. Fox News correspondent Peter Doocy reports on a very public farewell yesterday in Washington.
Oh, Danny boy, oh, Danny boy, I love you so.
Lawmakers, loved ones, and diplomats gathered Saturday for a final goodbye to Senator John McCain.
The world will be lonelier without John McCain.
One of McCain's best friends, former Senator Joe Lieberman, told mourners about the time McCain asked him to join the GOP ticket, even though he was a registered Democrat.
John's response was direct and really ennobling. That's the point, Joe, he said with a certain impatience. You're a Democrat, I'm a Republican. We could give our country the bipartisan leadership it needs for a change.
McCain's former political rivals spoke on his behalf, too.
In recent years, we sometimes talk of that intense period like football players remembering a big game. In the process, rivalry melted away.
So much of our politics, our public life, our public discourse can seem small and mean and petty. John called on us to be bigger than that.
McCain's daughter Megan broke from her tear-filled tribute to more sharply criticize the current president, who wasn't invited.
The America of John McCain has no need to be made great again because America was always great.
And joining me now here in Washington, John McCain's good friend, Senator Lindsey Graham. Welcome again to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you for having me.
You are speaking today at the private ceremony at the U.S. Naval Academy, your tribute. First of all, how are you doing? And secondly, what are you going to say?
Well, I'm doing okay. These things help. Thank you to everybody who's called and asked me how I'm doing. Cindy and everybody else around the family has helped me as much as I've helped them, probably more. So I'm going to say that nobody loved a soldier more than John McCain, that I bear witness to his commitment to have their back, travel where they go, never let them be forgotten. The public may be tired of this war called the war on terrorism, but John McCain never was, and he had their back, and he gave them what they needed to win a fight we can't afford to lose, and he was willing to lose a political race but not a war. So I'm going to talk about all my travels with the troops and how much they love John McCain.
I have to ask you about the passionate, heartfelt, but sometimes angry tribute by Meghan McCain, who took some pretty clear shots at President Trump. Here's a clip.
We gather here to mourn the passing of American greatness. The real thing, not cheap rhetoric from men who will never come near the sacrifice he gave so willingly, nor the opportunistic appropriation of those who live lives of comfort and privilege while he suffered and served.
Was that appropriate? Was it fair?
If you say something bad about Meghan's father, you will know it. She didn't like it, so it's okay. She's grieving. All I can say is there's a lesson to be learned this week about John McCain. Number one, Americans appreciate military service. If you've learned nothing this week, you know the fact that John served our country in extraordinary circumstances was appreciated by everybody. What else did we know? That if you work hard and do your homework and know what you're talking about, people will listen to you. That if you pick big causes, bigger than yourself, you'll be remembered. He tried to drain the swamp before it was cool. That you can fight hard and still be respected. If you forgive, people appreciate it. And if you admit to mistakes, you're looked at as a stronger man. That's the formula of John McCain. This was a civics lesson for anybody who wanted to listen. Why do we remember this man? Because of the way he conducted his public life.
And do you think there's a lesson there for President Trump?
There's a lesson here for everybody, including President Trump. Everybody makes mistakes. Those who admit it are seen by the public as bigger, not smaller. Know what you're talking about. Fight hard, forgive, and have passion. Strength and kindness are not mutually exclusive.
Let's turn to your day job, and this week you're going to be spending a lot of time as a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee in confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh to be confirmed to the Supreme Court. First of all, does he have the votes to win confirmation of the court?
If he does well at the hearing, he will get, my belief is 55 or higher if he does well, and I'm sure he will do well.
When you say 55, you've got to have 51 Republicans with the appointment of McCain's replacement. So you're saying as many as 4 Democrats?
Well, that's 55. Last time
that's
I
what
checked. Yeah, I'm not good at math, but yeah, I think there are a handful of Democrats who will vote for Judge Kavanaugh if he does well, and maybe even more. A lot of people should vote for Judge Kavanaugh. If you're looking to a Republican president to pick a qualified conservative, he would be on the top of anyone's list, including not just Donald Trump. He's the one person I think every Republican president would see as the most qualified of their generation.
Democrats say that the confirmation should be delayed until we know whether or not there's going to be either a criminal prosecution of President Trump or impeachment proceedings against President Trump. Here is Senator Dick Durbin, who's going to be on the program next.
We should be withholding this decision on the Supreme Court nominee until the air is cleared and we know exactly where we stand when it comes to this president and his culpability.
Given that his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, says that candidate Trump in 2016 directed him to commit a crime, does Senator Durbin have a point?
Well, it wasn't the point he had when Clinton was under investigation. We approved Justice Breyer. So my Democratic friends did not have this view when Clinton was president.
You should point out, I'm going to bring it up, with Senator Durbin, 1994, Clinton is under investigation by an independent counsel on Whitewater, and he was nominated, and Senator Stephen Breyer was confirmed to the court.
Well, Senator Grassley's been very fair. More documents given than any person ever nominated to the Supreme Court. We're going to have a hearing. There's no drama in this hearing. The only drama is those running for president. How will they handle this hearing on the Democratic side? We're going to get this good man confirmed.
Let me ask you, though, about this question of criminal liability. I want to look at some of Kavanaugh's statements on that issue. Let's put them up. In 1999, Kavanaugh said the Nixon ruling that President Nixon had to turn over all of the White House Watergate tapes may have been, quote, wrongly decided. In 2009, Kavanaugh wrote, criminal investigations take the president's focus away from his or her responsibilities to the people. Is there a legitimate concern that Justice Kavanaugh, if he were faced with a case on the Supreme Court, would side with the president against either Congress or the courts?
Well, what I think you'll find is somebody's had 308 decisions, so you can get a pretty good idea of what he thinks based on his time on the Court of Appeals. But the bottom line here is that most people are unsure as to whether or not a president can be indicted, a sitting president. Impeachment is a process to remove a president. The criminal liability aspects are very much in debate. I think he's going to be mainstream in his thinking. He's going to look at both sides of the issue and decide appropriately.
One issue that pro-choice senators of both sides have pressed Kavanaugh on in their meetings with him on Capitol Hill is abortion. And Kavanaugh reportedly told them that Roe v. Wade is, quote, settled law. Is that a firm commitment in your view, to not to overturn Roe? And if it is a firm commitment, how can you, as a pro-life senator, support it?
I wouldn't vote for anybody who said that no, every decision of the Supreme Court cannot be revisited. They're revisited through a process. There's a process of overturning long precedent. There's a four-part test you have to apply. From my point of view, what he will do is when that case comes, if it ever does, you just don't wake up one day and say, hey, I'd like to overturn Roe v. Wade. If there's a conflict that makes it to the Supreme Court, he will apply the test of precedent to that decision, Roe v. Wade, and every other precedent.
But to make it clear, you're saying you don't view his statement, for instance, as Senator Collins, a pro-choice Republican, that it's settled law means that therefore it can't be re-examined and conceivably overturned.
He would be disqualified, in my opinion, if he would not listen to both sides of the story and decide accordingly. This idea that Roe v. Wade is going to be challenged at state level. There are all kind of laws out there. Some may work up their way up to the Supreme Court. He will give great deference, I'm sure, to Roe v. Wade, but it can be overturned like every other decision, but that will be up to the facts and the record.
Senator Grimm, thank you. Thanks for your time on a tough week, and our deepest sympathies on the loss of a dear friend, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Joining me now from Illinois, another member of the committee that will be questioning Judge Kavanaugh, Dick Durbin, the Senate's #2 Democrat. Senator, Democrats have tried a variety of efforts to upend and derail the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh. I want to put some of them up. The argument that there's a midterm election, the argument that President Trump is under investigation. You want to see millions of pages of documents from when he was staff secretary for President George W. Bush, and the White House has now invoked executive privilege to withhold 100,000 pages from when Kavanaugh worked for the White House counsel. I think it's fair to say that none of that has worked. And the question is, why is it the Democrats have so far been unable to gain any traction against Judge Kavanaugh in the public debate? You don't seem to have laid a glove on him.
Chris, let me just say at the outset, though, before we get into that, and I'll address it, I join with Lindsey Graham every word he said about John McCain. I respect John McCain so much, and yesterday was a great display of the respect so many people across this country had for this great American. I was lucky enough to be with Lindsey and John involved in some very important negotiations for more than a year on comprehensive immigration reform, so I back up every word. So let me just start with Brett Kavanaugh in this way. He is the most unpopular Supreme Court nominee in the last 40 years. How did he reach that point so quickly? Well, I think there were a number of reasons for it. And you look at them, first and foremost, is the fact that this president said, I'm not going to put a man on the Supreme Court unless he's going to overturn Roe versus Wade and the Affordable Care Act. The president is never at a loss for words, and he was very explicit in terms of what he wanted in a Supreme Court nominee. Those positions may be popular with his Republican base. They're not popular with the American people.
Wait,
and the issue that you have raised...
Wait, I mean, he said he was going to appoint pro-life judges. He never said that he asked him or on a litmus test about that. And I have to say, I'm a little surprised that you're saying he's the most unpopular. When did we nominate and confirm Supreme Court justices based on public opinion polls?
Well, we shouldn't be. But you started off with the premise you've never laid a glove on him. The fact of the matter is the American people have gone through this nomination and come to the conclusion that he's not the right person for the job. Let me go a little bit further here. He comes before us at a time when people are concerned about whether this president or any president is above the law. Think about his role, Kavanaugh's role, when it came to Judge Ken Starr going after President Clinton. He was the aggressive prosecutor in that respect, and a few years later, after working in the Bush White House, said, I completely reversed my position. A president should not be subject to investigation or prosecution while he's in office.
Let me just ask you about that, because as Lindsey Graham brought up, and I was going to ask you anyway, in 1994, Bill Clinton was under investigation by an independent counsel on Whitewater, and he nominated, and the Senate confirmed Stephen Breyer, and that was also in a midterm election year. That really directly contradicts two of the arguments that you're making against Kavanaugh.
Let me just say that I was not a member of the Senate when Justice Breyer came before that body. But I will tell you, at the time the investigation was underway, there was no suspicion at that moment that Clinton was going to brush it aside and say, you have no authority to even question me. It went forward. He was subpoenaed. He was deposed. He was tried in the House, and I should say indicted under the impeachment clause in the House and tried in the Senate. I was in the Senate at that time. And now we have a different situation completely. There is a serious question as to whether this president, given the opportunity, will end the Mueller investigation, something which most Republicans and the overwhelming majority of Americans say would be a serious mistake. And we ask, of course, Judge Kavanaugh, what do you think? And he says it's hands off when it comes to a president during his term in office. I think that's a mistake, and it's one of the major reasons people have misgivings about his nomination.
Let's look at some specific issues. As I pointed out, Kavanaugh has told some pro-choice senators that he views Roe as settled law. He was asked about Obamacare. There's a Texas case that would try to take it all down because of the fact that the individual mandate has been repealed. He said that he was very skeptical of that. Obviously, these aren't firm commitments. You wouldn't expect that from any judge. Isn't the real problem, Senator, that this is a conservative judge? Donald Trump went to the country and promised to nominate conservative judges, originalists who would interpret the Constitution as written. And isn't he well within the mainstream? Yes, conservative, but within the judicial mainstream.
Well, you overlook one of the most important elements in his nomination, and that is the fact that there has been more concealment of documents concerning his public service and his position on issues than ever in the history of the United States.
They've given you 500,000 documents, sir.
Let me just make my point here, Chris. The assertion of executive privilege by the White House to take 100,000 documents and say the American people will not get a chance to see them as they reflect on Kavanaugh's background is the first time in history. This denial of access to documents violates a rule that we thought was the tradition of the Senate under Senator Sessions and Senator Leahy, time and again when it came to Obama nominees. They are suppressing these documents. If we're lucky, we will see 6% of all of the documents that have been produced or could be produced to reflect on Kavanaugh's true position on issues. He is saying, and the White House saying, the American people have no right to know. So if he's so proud of his conservative credentials, show us the record. Stand before us. Trust the American people, and they'll trust you. I would say that to Judge Kavanaugh.
And you'll have the opportunity to do that starting on Tuesday. Let me just say, as a point of saying goodbye, they have turned over 500,000 documents, and the issue, part of it is about 3 million documents when he was staff secretary, and every document that went to the president went through his desk. But Senator Durbin, thank you. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to your questioning of Judge Kavanaugh starting this week.
Thanks, Chris.
Always good to talk with you, sir. Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss what to expect from this week's showdown between the president's Supreme Court pick and Senate Democrats. Plus, what would you like to ask the panel about how Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation would change the Supreme Court? Just go to Facebook or Twitter at Fox News Sunday, and we may use your question on the air.
We need to elect senators who will vote for judges who follow our laws and our Constitution as written.
President Trump on the campaign trail this week, making the case for his choice of Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Former press secretary for Vice President Pence, Mark Lotter. Charles Lane of the Washington Post. Former Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards, and Washington Post columnist and former White House speechwriter Mark Thiessen. Chuck, when Justice Kennedy, the swing vote on the court, stepped down and there was talk about replacing him, we heard all this talk about a fierce battle for the future of the court. And I want to ask you the same question that I asked Senator Durbin. Why hasn't it happened? The Democrats don't seem to have gained much traction against Brett Kavanaugh so far.
I think there's a lot of reasons, starting with the fact that it's just possible Republicans care a little bit more about this than actually Democrats do. I did a little checking, and Democrats were a little bit less likely than Republicans to vote in 2016 based on the future of the Supreme Court. So there's a little bit of a surprising passion gap there. Secondly, I think this is a very simple fact that this is about 51 votes, and the Republicans have 51 votes. And that means two things. One, Mitch McConnell can control the pace of this thing. He can control the calendar and so forth. And secondly, it means the Democrats are just struggling to get over that mark. And they are divided, not divided down the middle, but they're divided between the main bloc of the party and several people who have to run for re-election in red states. That's created a very difficult problem in messaging for them. And so they're left dealing not with the substance of the Kavanaugh thing, but procedural issues like document disclosure, arcane matters, very important but very arcane, about executive privilege. And the net effect is that they've yet to identify some hot button thing that can get the public excited against Judge Kavanaugh.
We ask you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Twitter from Whereas Waldo, which after I read it several times I realized was some person's interpretation of where is Waldo. When did adhering to the United States Constitution become radical and threatening? Mark Lotter, how do you answer that?
Well, I think that's the basis of this argument. And we have, in Judge Kavanaugh and in Justice Gorsuch, we have someone who adheres to the Constitution. And many on the liberal side prefer to appoint justices who interpret the law to mean things other than what it says. That's the heart of the argument.
I want to turn to the nation's farewell to John McCain, which has been the big story this week, and his daughter Meghan's tribute to him at the National Cathedral yesterday, which still has a lot of people talking. Here's part of that.
The America of John McCain has no need to be made great again because America was always great.
Mark Thiessen, it's her dad. Yep. She obviously feels passionately about the fact that she thinks that President Trump didn't treat her dad well, and he didn't. What did you think of her remarks?
Well, first of all, just watching her this week has been heartbreaking because her grief has been palpable, and so was her anger palpable yesterday, and with good reason, because Donald Trump treated her father disgracefully. If you want to put this in perspective, there have been 1,974 United States senators since the founding of the Republic. John McCain is only the 6th senator to lie in state who wasn't either a vice president or president. So this is a tremendous testament, and there are only 31 people in American history who've lain in state. This may very well be the first time that the sitting president of the United States has not participated in honoring that person, and that is a result of his disgraceful behavior towards him. He was even criticizing John McCain by name a few weeks ago on the campaign trail to suggest that he wasn't a war hero and never apologized for that. This is one of the reasons, Chris, why I think that Donald Trump, despite a booming economy, his disapproval has reached now 60% in the country. It's not because people don't like his policies, because his policies are obviously improving the lives of people. The economy is booming. Unemployment is low. But his inability to be presidential and to rise to the occasion at a moment like this, put aside his petty grievances against John McCain, I think that's one of the reasons why his popularity doesn't match his success as president.
Congresswoman Edwards, I promise I'm going to bring you in, but Mark Lotter is somebody who often defends this president. Your reaction?
Well, I think it takes two to tango, and I think John McCain, Senator McCain, has made a very good career out of attacking presidents when he disagreed on both sides of the aisle.
But in fairness, he somehow had a good enough relationship with George W. Bush and Barack Obama that they spoke at his funeral.
And he did, and this is one that continued on this week. And I think once we get past this, we will remember John McCain for all of his great service. The president is going to continue to go on, and he's going to do many of the things that John McCain supported, like supporting our troops, investing in our military, and we'll let their disagreement, I guess, go on in history.
Congresswoman Edwards, your reaction to Meghan McCain's remarks, and when you take in addition, because it wasn't just McCain, it was Joe Biden, and it was Barack Obama, and it was George W. Bush, the last Republican president before Trump. Was this week a rebuke of President Trump?
Well, I think that Meghan McCain's remarks and all of the remarks of the various speakers were John McCain speaking. His hand was clearly evident in those remarks, and particularly in Meghan's remarks, and I think that they were spot on for where we are in this nation. You know, I come from a military family too, and I think that for the President of the United States not to have honored and recognized Senator McCain's service, irrespective of policy disagreements, I think was disgraceful. And I think the nation stood up and said that it was disgraceful too, and that all of those speakers indicated that what was valued in Senator McCain, in addition to his service and his honor, was his commitment to this country, and that we had a President of the United States who seemed incapable of even acknowledging that.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. Panel, we have to take a break here. We'll see you a little later. Up next, President Trump threatens to cut Canada out of a new NAFTA deal and forge ahead just with Mexico. What would that mean for workers and the economy? On this Labor Day weekend, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka joins us next.